Not a dollar bill, not a stock certificate, just paper, plain paper. Now imagine someone tells you that piece of paper is worth a loaf of bread today, but tomorrow it'll only buy half a loaf, and the day after that, a quarter of a loaf. And by next week, that same piece of paper won't even buy you a single grain of rice. You think that sounds insane, right? You think no government in history would ever be dumb enough to let that happen. But here's the thing, it didn't just happen once. It's happened dozens of times all over the world. And every single time, the government responsible thought they were doing the right thing. They genuinely believed they had found a shortcut, a clever trick, a way to make the economy grow without paying the price. And every single time, ordinary people, people just like you and me, paid that price instead. Today, I want to tell you the story of one of the worst financial mistakes a country ever made. And I don't mean a small accounting error or a bad trade deal. I mean a decision so catastrophically wrong that turned millionaires into beggars overnight. A mistake so severe that people needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single egg. I'm talking about hyperinflation, and the country I want to focus on is Weimar Germany, the economic collapse of the 1920s that still stands as one of the most dramatic, instructive, and genuinely terrifying financial disasters in human history. But here's what makes this story different from what you learned in school. This isn't just a history lesson. This is a story about a psychological trap, a trap that governments fall into, that individuals fall into, that entire societies fall into. A trap that, honestly, isn't as far away from your everyday life as you might think. So let me take you back, not to a dusty textbook, but to a morning in 1923, to a bakery in Berlin. A man named Heinrich wakes up early. He's a baker. He's been doing this his whole life. His father was a baker, his grandfather was a baker. He knows how to run a business. He checks the price list he printed the day before. He crosses it out. The numbers are already wrong. He writes new numbers in pencil. He'll probably have to cross those out too by afternoon. His wife comes in and tells him she just heard on the radio that the price of flour has gone up again. Not by a little, not by 10%. It has literally doubled since yesterday morning. Heinrich doesn't panic. He's somehow gotten used to this. But he is exhausted. Because here's what life in Weimar Germany looked like at the height of hyperinflation in 1923. Prices were doubling not every year, not every month, not every week. At the absolute peak, prices in Germany were doubling every single day. Workers would get paid in the morning and immediately sprint, literally run to the nearest shop to spend their wages before the money lost half its value by lunchtime. Some people were paid twice a day just so they could keep up. You'd get your wages at noon, run out, buy whatever you could, come back, finish your shift, get paid again, run out again. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November of that same year. Let me say that again slowly, because it's hard for the brain to even process. 250 marks to 200 billion marks in less than 12 months. People were burning currency in their fireplaces because it was cheaper than buying firewood. There's a famous story, and historians debate whether it's literally true or more symbolic, of a woman who left a wheelbarrow full of money outside a shop while she went inside to buy something. When she came back, the money was scattered on the ground. Someone had stolen the wheelbarrow and left the cash. The wheelbarrow was worth more than the money. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, but how does something like this actually happen? Countries have governments. Governments have economists. Surely someone saw this coming. Surely someone could have stopped it. And that's exactly the point. Someone did see it coming. Multiple people saw it coming. And the government chose to do it anyway. Because to understand how Weimar Germany's hyperinflation happened, you have to understand the single most seductive lie in all of economics. And that lie is this: we can just print more money. Let me break this down in the simplest way I can possibly break it down. Think about money like tickets to a concert. Imagine there are exactly 100 tickets available for a show, and the venue has exactly 100 seats. Every ticket is worth one seat. Simple. Now imagine the venue manager, for whatever reason, decides to print 900 more tickets. Now there are 1,000 tickets in circulation, but still only 100 seats. What happens to the value of each ticket? It collapses, because suddenly your ticket isn't special anymore. It doesn't guarantee you a seat. There are 10 times as many tickets as seats, so you're going to need 10 tickets to get what one ticket used to get you. That's inflation in its most naked form. More money chasing the same amount of goods means each unit of money is worth less. Now, this process works slowly under normal conditions. Central banks in most countries actually do allow a small amount of inflation every year, usually around 2%, because a tiny bit of inflation encourages people to spend and invest rather than hoard cash. That's considered healthy. But what happened in Germany after World War I wasn't tiny, it wasn't gradual, and it wasn't accidental. Germany had just lost the war. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 was brutal. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war and pay reparations to the Allied powers. The total bill, adjusted to today's money, was somewhere around $400 billion. Germany didn't have that money. Germany's economy had been gutted by 4 years of devastating war. Factories were damaged, farmland was scarred, millions of working men were dead. So the German government faced a choice. And here's where the psychological trap begins. The choice was essentially this: do we go through the painful, brutal, politically unpopular process of cutting government spending, raising taxes, and restructuring the economy, or do we find a shortcut? Pain now or pain later? And almost every government in history, when faced with that choice, picks later. So Germany printed money. At first, it wasn't that dramatic. After the war ended in 1918, the German government printed some extra marks to cover government expenses. The war had been expensive, the reparations were expensive, and politically nobody wanted to raise taxes on a population that was already suffering. So they printed. And when inflation picked up, they didn't stop. They printed more, because stopping now would mean admitting the problem and starting the painful process of fixing it. Think about this from a psychological perspective for a second, because this is crucial. Imagine you're deeply in debt. You have a credit card you can't pay off, so instead of cutting your spending, which is painful and requires real sacrifice, you apply for another card with a 0% introductory rate and transfer the balance. You've bought yourself 12 months. When those 12 months are up, if the underlying spending habit hasn't changed, you do it again. Another card, another transfer. You're not solving the problem. You're printing money, metaphorically. Or think about the person who dips into their retirement savings because cash is tight this month. They tell themselves they'll put it back next month. Next month comes and something else comes up, so they take a little more and a little more. Each individual decision feels reasonable, necessary even, but the pattern, compounded over time, leads to a place where the bill can no longer be avoided. And here's the really uncomfortable insight. Because the moment Germany could have stopped this spiral with the least pain was at the very beginning, right after the war, when inflation was just starting to pick up. A small amount of discipline then would have prevented an unimaginable catastrophe later. But humans don't tend to act when problems are small. We act when they're unavoidable, and by then, the cost is always much, much higher. Now, let me tell you what actually happened when Germany finally hit the wall, because this part is just as important as everything that came before it. By November 1923, the German economy was completely non-functional. The currency was worthless. The middle class had been obliterated. People who had spent their entire lives saving money, building up real wealth through discipline and sacrifice, woke up one day to find that their savings could not buy a single loaf of bread. A retired school teacher who had the equivalent of a very comfortable nest egg in 1913 had enough money in 1923 to buy 1 cup of coffee. Not a nice retirement, a cup of coffee. Meanwhile, people who had taken on debt before the inflation found that their debts were wiped out too, because the money they owed was now worthless. If you borrowed 1,000 marks to buy a house in 1918, by 1923, you could pay off that entire loan with what you'd find under your sofa cushions. So inflation created two extreme groups, debtors who got out completely free and savers who lost absolutely everything. Think about the psychological damage that does to a society. Think about what it teaches people. It teaches them that saving is pointless, that discipline is for sluckers, that working hard and being careful with money will get you nowhere, that the system is rigged. And a society that learns those lessons becomes very, very dangerous. Many historians directly link the economic trauma of Weimar Germany's hyperinflation to the political instability that followed, the desperation, the anger, the willingness to believe in radical solutions from radical leaders who promised to fix everything. The economic collapse didn't directly cause what came next in German history, but it absolutely cleared the ground for it. Money isn't just numbers on paper. Money is trust. And when trust collapses, everything collapses with it. Now, here's where I want to pivot to something you might not have expected. Because when most people tell the story of Weimar Germany, they end it there.
With the collapse, with the lesson that printing money is bad. But there's a second half to this story that almost nobody talks about. And it's actually the more hopeful and more instructive part. Germany fixed it, not slowly, not gradually, in an almost shockingly short amount of time. In November 1923, the same month Adolf Hitler attempted his failed beer hall putsch, by the way, which gives you a sense of how chaotic things were, the German government introduced a brand new currency called the Rentenmark. The idea was almost brilliantly simple. The new currency was backed not by gold, which Germany didn't have, but by German land and industrial property. In other words, it was backed by something real and tangible. The government also did something incredibly difficult. They stopped the printing presses. Just stopped. They also brought in a new commissioner of currency, a man named Hjalmar Schacht, who essentially said, no more emergency money, no more printing to cover government debts, no more shortcuts. Germany would live within its means. The results were extraordinary. Within weeks, not months, not years, the hyperinflation stopped. People who had spent months literally running to shops to spend their wages before prices doubled again suddenly found that prices were stable. 1 Rentenmark was equal to 1 trillion of the old marks. And just like that, confidence returned. Not completely, not without scars. Germany still had enormous problems, massive unemployment, foreign debt, social trauma. But the economy began to function again, and it did so almost immediately once people trusted the money again. This is the part of the story that I think contains the most important lesson. Because what actually ended Germany's hyperinflation wasn't some complex financial engineering. It wasn't a bailout from a foreign power. It wasn't a magic formula. It was a credible commitment to stop doing the thing that was causing the problem. That's it. The cure for printing too much money was to stop printing too much money. But, and this is the part that takes real psychological strength, you have to be willing to endure the short-term pain of that adjustment. There will be a period where things feel worse before they get better. People will complain. Politicians will be voted out. There will be unemployment and hardship. You have to trust the process even when it hurts. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with you? You're not the German government. You don't have a printing press. But you do have something very similar. You have a credit limit. You have a buy now, pay later button. You have overdraft protection. You have the ability to push financial pain into the future. And just like the German government, every time you use one of those tools without a plan to genuinely solve the underlying problem, you're choosing short-term comfort over long-term stability. Let me walk you through some of the ways this plays out in everyday life. The first is what I call the lifestyle inflation trap. You get a raise. Instead of directing that extra income toward debt or savings, you upgrade your life to match it. Nicer car, bigger apartment, more eating out. The raise feels like permission to spend more, and now your new, higher income is just as stretched as your old one, but your debts haven't gone anywhere. This is the personal version of printing money. Your income went up, But so did your baseline expenses. Nothing was actually saved. The second is the minimum payment illusion. You have a credit card with $2,000 balance. The minimum payment is $60 a month. $60 doesn't feel like much, so you pay $60. And next month, the balance is still almost $2,000, because most of that $60 went to interest. At a typical credit card rate, if you only ever pay the minimum, you'll be paying off that $2,000 purchase for years. You might end up paying $4,000 or $5,000 total for something that originally cost $2,000. The bank is essentially printing money, your money, out of thin air through interest, and you're letting them do it. The third, and this one is subtle, is comfort spending as a stress response. Life is stressful. Things go wrong. And research in behavioral economics consistently shows that when people feel financially stressed, they are more likely to make impulsive purchases to get a short-term emotional hit. You're anxious about money, so you buy something. It feels good for a moment. Then you feel guilty and more anxious, so you buy something else. This is the same loop Germany was in. The problem creates the behavior that makes the problem worse. So what's the equivalent of Germany introducing the Rentenmark? What does stopping the printing press look like in your actual life? It starts with a hard, honest look at your financial reality, not your financial feelings, your actual numbers. Most people have a vague, uncomfortable awareness that they're spending more than they should, but vague awareness doesn't change anything. You need specificity. Write down what comes in each month, write down what goes out. Not what you think goes out, what actually goes out. Go through your bank statements, every subscription, every coffee, every small purchase that felt like nothing. Most people, when they do this for the first time, are genuinely shocked, not because they find one huge problem, but because they find 20 small ones that nobody ever talked about. The second thing is to separate your wants from your anchors. An anchor is something that keeps pulling you back to a financial hole, a recurring expense you don't really need, a debt you're paying interest on but never making progress on, a habit that's costing you real money every week. Anchors are different from wants because they compound. A want is just spending. An anchor actively keeps your wealth lower than it would be otherwise. Identify your anchors, then eliminate them one at a time. Not all at once, that's too painful and people don't sustain it. One at a time, systematically. Third, and this is the big one, you need to understand the difference between money and wealth. Money is cash. It can be printed. It can be devalued. It can disappear. Wealth is the accumulation of assets, things that hold real value over time. Skills, real estate, businesses, stocks and companies that actually produce things, a diversified investment portfolio. The German middle class was destroyed in 1923 largely because their wealth was held in cash, savings accounts, government bonds, paper instruments that the government could and did make worthless. But people who held physical assets, land, buildings, productive businesses, they came through the crisis in a very different position. This is not an argument for hoarding gold under your mattress. It's an argument for understanding what real wealth looks like and building it deliberately. Real wealth is not your salary. It's not your bank balance. It's the collection of assets that continue generating value whether you're working or not. Assets that don't depend on any one government's printing decisions. The practical application of this right now in your life is to start moving money from the paper column to the real column. Invest in index funds that own pieces of actual businesses. Build skills that make you productive regardless of economic conditions. If you can, move towards owning rather than renting, not because property is always a perfect investment, but because it's a real asset rather than a recurring liability. And above all, avoid debt that doesn't build real assets. Good debt, in principle, is debt that acquires something worth more than the debt itself. A student loan for a degree that genuinely increases your earning power. A mortgage on a property that builds equity. These can work. Bad debt is debt that funds consumption, debt to buy things that go down in value, debt to pay for experiences that leave no lasting financial trace. This is the personal equivalent of printing money, short-term comfort bought with long-term instability. Let me bring this back to where we started. Heinrich the baker in Berlin in 1923, crossing out yesterday's prices, writing new ones in pencil, knowing he'll have to do it again tomorrow. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't make bad decisions. He was a hard-working, careful man who had tried to live prudently and responsibly. But the system around him had been built on a lie, the lie that you can have something for nothing, that pain can be permanently avoided rather than just deferred, that printing paper and calling it money creates real wealth rather than just diluting existing wealth. And when that lie finally came apart, as all such lies eventually do, it came apart so fast and so completely that there was nothing ordinary people could do to protect themselves, unless they had already understood in advance that paper is just paper.
Here's the thought I want to leave you with. Every financial decision you make today is a vote for the kind of financial future you'll live in, not just individually, though that absolutely matters, but collectively as a society. Because the conditions that led to Germany's hyperinflation didn't come from nowhere. They came from a culture, a political culture, yes, but also a broader social culture that had become addicted to short-term thinking, that had stopped believing that delayed gratification was possible or even worth it. When a culture loses the ability to say, not now, later, when every discomfort must be immediately soothed and every pleasure must be immediately satisfied, you get a version of the printing press. Maybe not a literal one, but something that functions exactly the same way. The antidote isn't suffering for its own sake. It's not about punishing yourself or living like a monk. It's about understanding the difference between real value and the feeling of value, between genuine progress and the illusion of progress, between building something and borrowing against a future that may not look the way you imagine. The worst financial mistake a country ever made wasn't technical. It wasn't a flaw in their accounting software or a typo in a budget report. It was a failure of patience, a failure of honesty, a failure to look at a growing problem and say clearly and early, we have to deal with this now, even though it hurts. That failure is available to all of us every single day, and so is the alternative. Take care of your money, understand it, respect it, and above all, don't fool yourself into thinking that the bill, whatever the bill is, won't eventually come due. Because in the end, it always does.